Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries RPG podcast with John and Hannah.
Hi.
Now, you may have thought that a cloak was just a garment going back to Roman times or a handy piece of travelling gear, but if you're not careful, you might get a bit more than you bargained for. Today we're going to be looking at the Cloaker. Okay, so starting off, as we have been doing previously, with the first edition AD&D Monster Manual 2. In it, the Cloaker is described as a shadow-dwelling, unearthly creature. It's a very rare monster that's encountered in deep, dark caverns, which is described as having alien, entirely inhuman thought processes. It's described as bearing a striking resemblance to a cloak, but it has like a mouth and eyes on the inside of it, which, I've got to be honest, love, that seemed a bit of an odd idea for camouflage for like the Underdark to me. Now, I don't know. I mean, maybe the Drow and the Darrow and the Durgar and whatever have got a mad on for cloaks. I don't know. But it just seems a bit odd you'd come across a cloak.
See, I always thought of it as being a creature that was kind of like a cuttlefish in its capabilities of hiding. And it's just discovered that if it looks like a fancy cloak, then humans will come and like poke at it, and then it can eat them.
That sounds a bit spurious.
High intelligence. I mean, what's its stat in the first edition?
Yeah, but it's described as being like entirely alien in its thought process. Well, thinking, oh, I look a bit like a cloak. I'll go and hijack somebody. Doesn't really sound entirely alien to me. It sounds pretty human.
Yeah, but I've seen pictures of cuttlefish in like experimental tanks playing tic-tac-toe to get food. If a couple of times you hide and you look like the thing that you're next to and it happens to be a piece of fabric, and you realise that humans aren't frightened of fabric, and they walk right up to it and pick it up and pretty much put their mouth
seems an unlikely circumstance in the Underdark, but maybe I'm wrong. Like I say, maybe the Drow have got a mad on for cloaks. I don't know. One of the main attacks of the Cloaker is that they fly towards foes and they sort of wrap them up, and then they can bite them with their mouth on the inside. Mm-hmm. Any attacks that someone does against the Cloaker while they've wrapped up a victim does half that damage to the victim as well. They can emit an unearthly moaning, which causes a -2 penalty to those who hear it, and as it rises in intensity, it causes various other magical effects, such as fear and the stinking cloud effect. It can manipulate shadows, gaining +1 AC bonus when in shadow, unless a light spell is cast on it, which also blinds the Cloaker. The artwork's okay. I mean, it's black and white, does the job. It's nothing special. I mean, it's a sheep with mouth and eyes, you know, what do you expect? But why don't you tell us a bit about the AD&D 2nd Ed Monster Manual, love?
So, it's one of the iconic creatures from the 2nd Ed Monster Manual, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
Because it's just, as you say, so weird and so unlikely. And I think every 14-year-old GM wants to, like, populate a dungeon with creatures like this.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
I mean, it strikes me very much as well that the artwork is much improved in this, because it still looks like a cloak, which they sort of get away from in later editions, but we'll talk about that in a bit. It very much looks like a cloak, but it's more animated, it's more dynamic, and obviously there's colour on it as well, which helps it sort of stand out. So that's pretty cool.
So we get a brief rundown of the description, which again is very similar. It's got these 2 rows of spots down its back that look a lot like buttons. It's got these claws that look a lot like a clasp. It's gonna remain still unless it needs to move. So it's gonna pass for a cloak. You have to assume with that sort of level of intelligence that it's doing that on purpose.
Yeah. I think as well we get some clarification in that on like various little bits of it just get like sort of tweaked and tuned up a bit. Like you get the clarification that when a foe's wrapped up, the Cloaker automatically does damage to them each turn afterwards. You don't have to roll to hit them, which is nice just to have it like all written down in black and white.
Yeah. As with many bits of 2nd Ed stuff, when they do clarify combat, it makes a lot more sense than 1st Ed usually.
One thing I did notice about the Cloaker in the second-hand monster manual, though, is that unlike a lot of creatures, there doesn't seem to be much additional ecology information.
No. It's got a lot of combat section compared to a lot of the other pages in this book to clarify the things you were mentioning, but also I think keeping it really short and saying no, it's virtually impossible to communicate with them, we don't know anything about their society, and we think they might be asexual.
Yeah, I mean, the only things it really seems to tell you is that they're very alien creatures, and they're like only mages who've specifically spent years and years trying to wrap their head around their thought processes and have made an intense study of them, can even like contemplate communicating with them, which I suppose is good in a way because it leaves you free to do what you want with them, and it does make them seem a bit more alien, but it also doesn't really give you a lot to go on other than like, here's what they're like in combat.
I think also that prevents you from, unless you want to have like a really high level villain mage, you can't have your characters talking to the Cloakers.
No, it's not feasible, is it?
Yeah, I think it sort of helps keep them alien to have such a weird creature as this.
So, moving on to the D&D 3.5 monster manual, you can see they've definitely tried to make the monster look less goofy in this, although in the previous versions it actually looked like a cloak. Now to me that looks like a stingray sort of dealio, and it looks pretty cool and it's menacing and it's alien, but it doesn't look like a cloak. Now that might just be the angle it's at, but the other ones, they even like the sort of like the fairly basic sort of first edition one, you looked at it and you were like, oh, it's called Cloaker, looks like a cloak. It was like an instant thing you could see, whereas I don't look at that and think cloak. I look at it and think stingray, like devil stingray.
Like moving flight position there, though. If it just relaxed its wings and sat on the floor and tucked its tail in underneath.
I don't know. It's maybe.
You know.
They get high levels in hide, listen, move silently, and spot skills. We're told that they take a cruel amusement in killing people, and they still have these sort of eerie moan, but now the Cloaker gets to choose from unnerve, fear, nausea, or stupor effects. Again, we don't really gain a great deal more on their sort of their habitat, their society, or whatever. We're just told they have these black eye spots on their back resembling buttons, and they have the ivory claws, which look very much like bone clasps. But when it unfurls, it reveals a horrid mouth underneath, and that they're alien and they have mysterious goals. And that's pretty much all you get within 3.5. So I'm going to go on to the 4th edition Monster Manual 3 now, which I've got here. So the artwork is clearly based off the 3.5 version of the creature. Again, it looks more fearsome, it's more dynamic, it's sort of mid-flight in an action pose. And again, it looks more to me like an alien stingray, but less like a cloak. But as Hannah said, that might just be because of the attack pose it's in, effectively. We're told they're solitary, cruel creatures that on rare occasions gather together and form together in this massive sphere-like formation. We get 2 sets of stats, the Ambusher, which is the base level Cloaker, and a Cloaker Lord, which is basically a beefed up version. And they have various sort of at-will powers, which mimic engulfing the foes, doing the eerie moan. Basically just 4th edition versions of the abilities they've got in the previous editions, to be honest. So, love, what about the latest edition of D&D, 5th edition, then? What does that tell us about them?
Same again, pretty much. So, the artwork on this one, the creature's got a much more substantial looking body on it.
Yeah, it's got a definite body rather than just being like a cloak with a mouth on it.
It's the one that looks most like an actual animal that could exist, you know, with organs and a skull and
I'll tell you what else it is.
Stuff inside it.
Tell you what else it is. The one that looks least like a fucking cloak.
Yep. So
Which is ironic, really, because I'm sure it says somewhere that they're named after their resemblance to cloaks. It specifically says that.
Yeah, because they look like dark leathery cloaks. Now, a leather cloak rather than a fabric cloak again.
Now, I think if we're talking about any of the previous, like the 3.5 or the 4th edition, I'd probably agree with you. But I think like the body shape and the head particularly is so distinctive. Previously, they've always been described as like the mouth and the eyes are set like into the body of the creature, like on the inside of the cloak. Whereas here, it looks to have an actual like distinct head and separate body with wings.
And it also does say further down that its body is composed entirely of cartilage and muscle, which allows it to flatten itself out. But yeah, it doesn't look particularly...
It doesn't make me think cloak when I look at it.
Yeah, it looks the most substantial creature, I think.
Which, now, don't get me wrong, if we'd gone to 5th edition and we'd looked for a creature and it was called, like, Devil Stingray, I'd have been like, that artwork's pimp. But when it's called a cloaker and everyone knows it's supposed to look like a cloak, that artwork, although good, doesn't really work for me.
These ones go out hunting.
Oh, right, okay.
They fly around the Underdark, pursue herds of Underdark beasts and attack the sick, the weak, or the straggling.
It's because they're chasing after all them drow with cloaks, that's what it is.
Haunting Moan, same again. And it also talks about Cloaker conclaves, which I think it's just put there to be a tongue twister for me.
I think that's the sort of like the version of, like, you know, when they glom together in this big sphere. Although it doesn't specifically mention the sphere in 5th edition, if I'm correct.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I did notice when looking at it is they seem to have like toned down the mirror image power they had in like the earlier versions. So like here it says they only get like 3 mirror images of themselves, whereas I think it's D6 plus 2 in like earlier versions.
Have you got something to add? Very constructive.
Yeah, I think, again, we get virtually no background on them in 5th edition, save that they're alien and they sometimes get together in these conclaves that you were talking about.
Yeah. It says that these are probably to exchange information about new dangers, suitable hunting grounds or development that might affect their habitats. And when it's complete, they separate again.
Okay, so anything else on the 5th edition?
Nope.
Well, now, this is a part where normally we go on to talk a bit about how you might potentially use them in games, but we've had a few call-ins recently from Joe at the Hindsightless podcast, who I know is a big fan of Pathfinder, so I've pulled out my copy of the Pathfinder 1st edition bestiary to look up cloakers in. And now this one definitely doesn't look like a cloak. That does look like a devil stingray. But the reason I like this is because in Pathfinder, it just leans into it. Straight away it says, resembling hideously evil flying manta rays, cloakers are mysterious and paranoid creatures. So it doesn't really lean on the whole like cloak thing. But what it does say is it says they can twist their strange shape to allow them to disguise themselves as cloaks, which... I know it's just semantics, but I found that easier to get my head around. It looks like a normal sort of manta ray style creature, but it can contort and disguise itself as a cloak. I really like that. It also says in here, which is something I'm going to talk about later, that they can... the stories of cloakers allying with other creatures, hitching a ride on their back and aiding their allies' protection for their own inscrutable reasons. And a rare few of them are priests of an ancient god. So you've got like a sort of a bit of a hint at sort of more of a background here. And they've got the whole like ruck ton of skills you'd expect for a Pathfinder creature. So they've got like disguise +8, +16 if they disguise themselves as a cloak, fly +10, knowledge, religion +11, high perception, sense, motive, stealth, all of that good stuff. And they can disguise themselves really well. They can engulf foes, which allows them to make grapple checks with bonuses, and they can emit the infrasonic moan as a standard action, which can either cause fear, nausea, stupor, or unnerve people. When they're within dim illumination, they can manipulate shadows as a free round to create one of 3 effects: blur, mirror image, or silent image, as per the spells. They've got a bite attack and the tail attack that we see in other editions of D&D. And I've got to say, I really quite like the artwork in this, to be honest. It doesn't really look like a cloak, but, you know, I find the fact that they've said it can disguise itself as a cloak, that sort of covers that for me. And I'm a pretty big fan of Pathfinder art, even though I don't really use the books very much. I don't really run Pathfinder. I think the artwork in it is just spot on, basically. And it's described as a ray-like creature opening a toothy maw and leering with glaring red eyes. Behind it whips a menacing tail of segmented bone. And I like, you find this throughout the bestiary, like each monster's description starts off with just like a little sort of 1 or 2 line quote, sort of summing up something about the creature. And I think that's really handy because it gives you like an instant hook into what the creature's about. Okay, so now we've talked a bit about the Pathfinder bestiary. How about we go on to talk a little bit about using them in games?
So, obviously, it's a pretty scary idea. You're walking through these big, dark, spooky caves, and then there's this, like, flapping behind you, and this thing that's massive drops down around one of your mates, wraps him up like he's in a big blanket, and then your mate's dead. And now it's coming for you, and so are its mates.
Yeah, I think it's another...
That's a scary monster.
I think it's another sort of, like, trap or, like, gotcha monster, you know, like... I mean, to me, it almost seems as it's designed to, like, sort of punish players who, like...
Oh, yeah, absolutely. This is clearly something that at some point was in some, like, early D&D dungeon where the DM went... Oh, I'm a bit sick of the players looting all the treasure instantly from everything. I'm going to put a monster in that looks like treasure.
Yeah, it's just like, oh, it's a treasure hoard, and some person's gone, all right, my character's going to grab this cloak, it looks like it might be magical, and just like bang it on, and the DM's like, oh, I'll deal with you. Oh, it's a monster, it's like wrapped around you and it's attacked you. And I can see that fits in with the sort of early D&D mood, you know, like death's lurking around every corner. If you don't check your loot or your supplies, lots of dangerous stuff could go down and you could lose a character. And I think later editions of D&D, in my opinion, have sort of moved away a bit of that. And I wonder if, like, the lessening of the Cloaker's resemblance to its namesake Cloak is partly down to that, because the whole, like, trap monster sort of like, surprise, it's not treasure, it's a monster that's got you, isn't really such a big thing anymore. So maybe they thought, oh, it doesn't really need to look like a cloak as much now because it's not being used for the same role. But I tell you what, I do like the idea of that they introduced later on. I like the idea of those Cloaker conclaves that they were talking about, and, you know, sort of like trying to understand them a bit more. I think that's quite cool. I think the idea of an alien mindset and trying to sort of unravel and study the purpose of these secret gatherings is quite interesting. However, the books don't really give you much of an idea, so you're pretty much on your own with it if you want to, something like that.
Yeah. So it mentions that some mages do spend a long time studying them and learning to communicate with them to some degree. That's an ideal sort of a patron character to ask your group, first of all, can you go out and find me some cloakers? Where are they? I want to study them. Secondly, can you go and do this thing? Can you go and do that thing to help me study them? I
think as well, you've also got potentially like interesting sort of like Cthulhu sort of madness style story. So it's that whole thing of, if you're trying to get yourself into the mindset of a completely alien, inhuman creature, it's that whole like a monster I am, less a monster I become sort of deal. Where like, if you sort of like study them too much, do you end up sort of adopting that mindset yourself?
That would be the third beat of that particular story arc, when he's able to communicate with them and maybe finds out he shouldn't really have wanted to in the first place.
Now, regarding the conclaves, I've got like a couple of ideas that I just came up with as like some random ideas that might perhaps explain them. I was thinking, like, what if the Cloakers are all like parts of a hive mind or like a single entity, and not the conclave, they're like joining back together? Or I thought, what about if they've got like a great link like the Dominion, like the Founders in Deep Space Nine? You know, where they all periodically come together to like share memories and stuff like that. I thought that could be quite cool.
Yeah, and you don't have to make Star Trek references to get me to agree with you.
Well, no, but I just thought it's an interesting idea, because one of the things about the Dominion in DS9 is, although they look like humans, they're very much portrayed as like not being humans, and they don't really understand or solids, as they call humans and the other races. They don't understand them, and they're at best trying to imitate them. And I think you could map a lot of that over onto the Cloaker, because they're sort of they're imitating, like you say, perhaps something they've encountered or they've seen a garment, but they don't really understand human or like sort of civilized society, for want of a better term. And they are these like alien creatures who are just sort of mimicking it to advance their own agenda. Another thing I was thinking about, which was spurred on by looking in the Pathfinder book, is the idea of it being like a parasite of some kind. Now, I like the idea of a creature disguising itself as a cloak, but it doesn't make a lot of sense for an Underdark creature, or one that just like grabs its victims and kills them like instantly.
I was actually just thinking that this would make quite an entertaining thing to do as a player character. That's somebody with a cloaker on their back, and the human body is irrelevant.
Yeah,
it's the cloaker that's the player character.
I mean, don't get me wrong, that smacks a bit of the Core Powers wacky character for my taste.
Oh yeah,
I think in the right sort of game it could work. I mean, I think, as we're saying, like, it's not really supported in like the sort of core D&D, but let's face it, it doesn't really take much tweaking of the Cloaker to imagine it as a parasite. I mean, perhaps it like it drains the character of like a little bit of like hit points or something or other every day, but the host can use some of its abilities. And I mean, depending on the amount that's actually drained from the host, it might be like a long-term partnership that goes on for a while. I mean, if you're okay, you've got to get your cleric mate to like heal you a bit more often, because like you're down a few hit points each day. But if you get the ability to cause fear in your enemies and maybe like fly like a cloaker and like use its tail attack, you might think, well, 3 hit points a day, that's actually like a bargain. Now, using that idea, I think you could also adapt the like sentient magic item rules in D&D. You know, like occasionally like a sentient sword or whatever, or take over its wielder. You could do a similar sort of thing with a cloaker, or perhaps the cloaker like, absorbs the host's memories over time, sort of storing that knowledge, and you could then say maybe that's why they come together in the conclave, because they all bring all those memories of all the people they've been joined with and like share them out amongst all the other cloakers. Also give you some opportunity for some fun bait and switches. I mean, perhaps the PCs in your game hear about a pale figure wearing a flowing dark cloak who flies through the air, always stays in the shadows, and has been preying on the people of the town in the hours of darkness. Now, most PCs are going to be like, vampire. But what if it's a person serving as a host for a cloaker? Perhaps the host's under the direct control of the cloaker, and like the host body's nearly used up, that's why it's pale, and the cloaker's using its pallid dying host to try and find another vessel. Or perhaps the host's done a deal with the cloaker, and by killing people, the cloaker feeds on them and not on him. And he's sort of like a devil's bargain sort of thing, and he gets the powers, and in return all he's got to do is like sacrifice like a few peasants or whatever to enable the cloaker to continue to feed. I think that could be an interesting way of using it. So have you got any other ideas for cloakers, or how you might like to use them in a game?
I don't know about in a game, but I'd love to make a prop of one. That's right up my alley, making, like, sewing up that sort of a raggy, gribbly thing where it's half cuddly toy, half costume.
See, I think it'd be funny as well, like, and I don't know how you'd use this in the game, it's a bit of a dumb idea, but I think it'd be funnier if, like, when the cloakers all, like, glommed together, instead of being a big sphere, all the cloakers went together and they just made, like, a bigger, different item of clothing. So, like, all the cloakers get together in the conclave and it's, like, a massive pair of trousers or something, all made up out of all these different cloakers, like, patchwork together.
See, I was thinking of them more like assembling in a neat little pinwheel and forming a gazebo.
Or maybe they all get together and it's like a big patchwork quilt of like cloakers. Like I said, I don't know how you'd use that, but I think that could be quite interesting. You could also go with the whole idea of if you imagine like each cloaker as maybe being a part of like a bigger organism, maybe they all sort of join together and each cloaker's like part of like the muscles of like a bigger creature that they form together to make in a sort of like, let's digivolve to our final form sort of style. So I think that could be interesting. Okay, so that's been our episode on the Cloaker. We hope you've enjoyed it. If you've got any ideas on how you might use cloakers in your games, any monsters you'd like us to look at in the future, or anything else you'd like to talk about in an episode, please get in touch. You can do so in a couple of ways. You can leave us a voicemail message using the SpeakPipe website. There's a link in the description of this show. or you can send us an email to rddrpgpodcast@gmail.com. Until we see you next time, take care, stay safe, whatever you're playing, have fun.
Bye.